Just okay, perfect. There it is. Wonderful. Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your Tuesday to attend this important conversation. Just going through the chat, we have folks from India, from London, from Sweden, Belgium, the Netherlands, Finland. This is absolutely fantastic. I can't believe we're at half 100 folks on this call. This is incredible. Just before we begin the introduction, I just want to go through a little bit of tech stuff. Please remember that to keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. Please do use the chat to ask questions during the presentation or during the talks. And most importantly, have a good time, you know, and do flag us if there's any technical issues or if we're glitching or anything like that we maybe aren't noticing. Just for everybody to remember, we are trying to make this a safer space. All comments, questions, and ideas are welcome, as long as they are respectful, they're mindful and thoughtful, yeah, let's just participate in a convivial and compassionate discussion. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce the International Degrowth Network that is helping host this conversation. The IDN is a collective of organizations, activists, researchers, artists, and practitioners committed to promoting and strategizing for degrowth. Established only 6 months ago, the IDN focuses on international cooperation, diverse narratives, community building, public awareness, and the implementation of degrowth strategies. Aya and I are both part of the, and I'm JP, by the way. I use he, they pronouns, and I'm currently in Paris, but I'm from Mexico City, Mexico. Aya and I are both part of the Global South Working Group Circle, and I'll let Aya introduce the work of this circle.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Aya. I'm from Egypt and Palestine, and I'm part of the Global South Working Group. Part of our mission as part of the IDN is centered on being a bridge between the degrowth movement and the Global South in general. Just from our experiences, we found in our communities that some people are kind of apprehensive when it comes to degrowth and hold some reservations. And from there, the idea came to us to go beyond degrowth and kind of inviting us to push the boundaries within degrowth and look into its blind spots. So essentially, we wanted to engage with solutions that are more centered on the realities experienced by the majority of the world. And that's why this series came to be, where we wanted to engage with speakers from the Global South. So without further ado, I'll let JP introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Aya. And don't forget, we're looking for comrades in our Global South circle, which you can join on degrowth.net. We'll share the link in the chat briefly. So we are extremely honored and so excited to have here with us Ashish Kothari. Ashish is a graduate in sociology. He has taught environment at the Indian Institute of Public Administration in the 1990s. He's been also a guest faculty at several universities, institutes, and colleges. He's been co-chair of the IUCN Intercommission of Strategic Direction on Governance, Equity, and Livelihoods in relation to protected areas for over a decade, and has been a member of several other international steering committees. He's also served on the board of directors of Greenpeace International and Greenpeace India. On a more grounded level, Ashish has been active with a number of people's movements, including the Save Narmada movement and Save the Seeds movement. He helps coordinate the Alternatives Confluence process in India and the global tapestry of alternatives globally. And lastly, he is the author and editor of over 30 books, including The Pluriverse, a post-development dictionary, which has been very influential for the degrowth movement, and over 400 articles. I cannot tell everybody how impressed and honored we are to be here speaking with Ashish. To get a rundown of the program, Ashish will begin the discussion with a presentation, after which Aya and I will ask some specific questions to get the discussion flowing, and we'll end up with a open Q&A where everyone is encouraged to participate. So I will shut up now and take it away, Ashish.
Thank you so much, JP and Naya. Hello to everybody. It's fantastic to see people from so many different parts of the world, including my fellow Indians, but also people from many, many other regions and countries of the world. So hello to everybody, and thanks for this wonderful opportunity. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, and so that we have maximum time for conversation, I will jump straight into the presentation. I'll speak for about 20, maximum 25 minutes, and then we can open it up for a long session of Q&A. So let me know, JP and Aya, if you're able to see the presentation.
Yeah, we'll let you know.
Yes?
Not yet.
Yep, we see it.
It's on? Okay. All right. Full screen?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so just shout out if there's anything wrong, because I don't see any of you. I'm only seeing my slides. Okay, so the first part of this, which I normally do in detail, I'm going to do in just 2 minutes, because we're all familiar with the horrible situation the world is in, multiple intersecting crises that we're all in one way or the other familiar with, whether we face them locally in our own villages and towns, or we know about the global crises, including climate, of course. The wars, the alienation, and much else. The fact that as a species, we have already crossed many of the planetary limits. We also know, and certainly from experience in India and elsewhere in the global south, that what comes in the name of development, of course, is beneficial to a lot of people, but it also comes with enormous amounts of violence towards the rest of nature and towards those communities who are most dependent on nature, such as forest dwellers and fishers and indigenous peoples, farmers, and so on. But also in one way or the other towards all of us. And I actually tend to think of this movement over the last few decades, or maybe the last few centuries of colonialism, as a move from livelihoods, which were work and occupations linked to the rest of nature, linked to culture and society, what we now have, which is the destruction of those livelihoods and the creation of mass industrial jobs, which I call deadlihoods, or which the late anthropologist David Graeber called bullshit jobs. We're also more and more familiar with, acutely aware of the fact that the so-called solutions that the same system that has created the problems is giving us, whether it's in terms of carbon trading or huge geoengineering projects, or even something like electric vehicles, actually are either false or very superficial solutions. They don't really get to the roots of the crises, and at the best, they will just postpone a little bit the kind of ecological and social collapses that we are seeing. So, obviously, then humanity's, I think, biggest question, and especially for the global south, but everybody else also, is: are there alternatives? Are there other ways of meeting human needs and aspirations without trashing the earth and without creating the kinds of inequalities, deprivations, conflicts, and wars that we see these days? And I tend to think of alternatives, real alternatives, in 2 ways. One is resistance itself, where people are more and more across the world are saying no, enough is enough. And they're not just saying no to particular deprivations or displacements or destructions that they themselves are facing, but which is the so-called not in my backyard syndrome, but actually saying not in anyone's backyard, and fundamentally challenging the structures of oppression and sustainability and injustice, including the ones that you see on the slide. Just to give you a very quick story of this particular image, it's from the late 1980s in India, a movement by 300 indigenous villages against 2 big dams, mega hydroelectricity projects. And in their movement against them, they were, of course, articulating that they don't want to be drowned, they don't want to be displaced, and they don't want their forests to be drowned, but also that while for the government and companies, the river was a commodity to be made into hydropower, for them, for us, the river is our mother. And we will not allow our mother to be shackled by your dreams of progress. So if you think about it, these sorts of resistance movements, these ones here, the youth climate justice movements, the anti-militarization movements, the peace movements, the anti-racism movements, etc., around the world, are not just about saying no, but also articulating other visions of how to relate to the rest of nature and to each other. But along with these movements of resistance, we also do need the creation of constructive alternatives to meet people's needs and aspirations. There are a couple of billion people who still don't have enough food or adequate nutritional food or clean drinking water or adequate housing or access to education and health services and so on. And so therefore there is a need for constructive alternatives. And I'm going to speak, I'll give a glimpse of some of these from around the world that I'm familiar with, especially from India, but also elsewhere. And there's many more that are in this book, which JP mentioned while introducing me, and I'll come back to this book towards the end. Firstly, also, of course, I love this map because at least when I show it in India and elsewhere in the global south, people say, why is it upside down? And that leads to a very interesting discussion about how even our cartography is colonized. Because our maps, the so-called normal upside maps, are where Europe is shown on top, and it's shown to be much bigger than the actual size of the continent. Here you can see how big Africa is, for instance, compared to Europe, and how England actually disappears. All right, so a glimpse, a very quick glimpse of some wonderful stories from around the world showing the potential of radical transformation and alternatives. This is from the Andes, the Parque de la Papa, which is where the Quechua indigenous peoples are conserving a very large biocultural landscape. This is one of the places where the potato originated. And using principles of radical direct democracy, ecofeminism, and much else, they are asserting their own identity, asserting their own food security and food sovereignty, which is to say complete control over everything to do with food, with no control by corporations or by governments. Back here in India, in central India, in the same region where the anti-dam protest, which I mentioned a few slides back, was held, there are now 90 villages who, as a result of that protest, began to mobilize themselves into asking the question of what is democracy itself? Why is it that decisions about our lands, our forests, our waters, our rivers are taken in New Delhi by somebody sitting far away? We should be the decision makers. So there's been movements across these 90 villages, which have federated into a Mahagram Sabha, which means like a federation of village assemblies against mining, but also to assert their identity, but also within themselves to ask questions about gender inequality or other forms of discrimination that might be practiced internally. So both external transformations and internal ones. Of course, if we talk about direct radical democracy, possibly the most well-known example in the world is the Zapatista in what is today called Mexico. JP says he's from there, so he would know this very well. This is a very inspiring example of how indigenous peoples have taken control over their own lives, kind of become autonomous of the nation state, the Mexican nation state, but also try to bring in principles of consensus decision making, of everybody being part of decisions, not just some village leaders or chiefs or whatever. And even though they have in the past, right in the beginning, used or created an army for self-defense, last 35 years they've actually not used violence, even in fact for self-defense. A similar movement, but in an even greater zone of conflict, is the Kurdish freedom movement, especially led by women in this awful quadrijunction between Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, from where millions of refugees have had to flee for various reasons. Here, the attempt is to try and create, by this 40 million strong Kurdish population, along with many other ethnicities, a zone of relative peace, of living with the earth, and of living with and governing with feminist principles. Down into Africa, this is a very inspiring example of a movement bringing together very diverse groups, including trade unions, who often don't necessarily work with environmentalists and vice versa, But here, many of them come together to over many years to create a pathway for South Africa out of the climate crisis, which is also just, especially for workers who are going to be displaced in the transition towards a climate sensitive economy, for instance, away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. What do workers who are, for instance, in mines or in thermal power stations, what do they do? And so this is an attempt to create a detailed charter that could bring in both ecological and social and economic justice. And then up into Europe, something that many of you may be more familiar with, where in the midst of very capitalist, very individualist societies, the attempt to try and create non-capitalist businesses, non-individualistic ways of living, communes, alternative currencies, factories that are run democratically by workers and not by capitalists. For instance, this one in Thessaloniki has a principle that all workers get exactly the same wage per hour of work, regardless of what work is done. Or the school on the top right-hand side, also in Greece, is run on very low fees, but with very high quality facilities and teaching, because the entire community around it, including the parents, contribute some hours free of cost to the school. And many other such attempts at trying to do more communal businesses, communal education, communal health and livelihoods and so on. Okay, I can actually go on and on for hours with examples, because that's the storytelling I love to do. But let me just end now in the next 5-6 minutes with what are the sorts of overall systemic transformations arising, and here to give a glimpse of some things emerging from the global south which go beyond degrowth, as is the title of the series. So in India, one of the processes that we've been running over the last 10 years called Vikalp Sangam, or the confluence of alternatives. Based on the stories on the ground, we have come up with what we call the flower of transformation, where we see change or transformations taking place in 5 spheres of life: the political, the economic, the social, the cultural, and the ecological. This is obviously a bit of an artificial distinction or categorization, but it helps just to understand what's taking place, and especially to look at the intersections amongst these different spheres of life. And at the core of this flower of transformation, possibly to me the most valuable lesson, is a set of values and ethics and principles, which I think is where the intersection between degrowth and other non-growth based approaches from the global south can come together. But I'll come back to that. So I don't have the time to go into each of these spheres or petals in detail, but just a quick glimpse. When one talks about politics, for instance, what the Zapatista, what the Kurdish movement, what the Adivasi or indigenous peoples of India are saying is that democracy is not about elections. We might want to go for elections. We might want to elect a state and make it accountable. But more importantly, we are decision makers where we are. In our village, we are the government. That kind of flips the notion of democracy on its head, and actually goes back to the original meaning of democracy, which means power of the people, not power of politicians and bureaucrats. This has many, many implications, which we can get into in our discussion. One of the implications also is that we then begin to question even political boundaries, especially nation-state boundaries, especially in areas that have been previously colonized. For instance, in South Asia, the division in South Asia between 6-7 countries is partly historical, pre-colonial, but partly also colonial. And what that has done is it's actually disrupted and stopped ecological flows, but also cultural flows. For instance, between Ladakh in India and Tibet, currently occupied by China, or India and Pakistan, or India and Bangladesh, and so on. And so how does one actually even reimagine political boundaries? The second very crucial aspect of this flower of transformation is the democratization of the economy, where instead of economic reins in the hands of capitalists or the state, it is in the hands of producers, whether they are factory producers or farmers or indigenous peoples or fishing communities or whatever, open source producers, whatever the producer might be that they own the means of production or control it, and it is in the commons. It is not privatized. Land is not privatized, and also that you start questioning the kind of inequalities, economic inequalities that are built into the capitalist society. You start questioning economic globalization and say, can we move much more towards localization and self-reliance, especially for, or at least for, basic needs. The third sphere of transformation is society or social justice, because the first two cannot work unless there is also a struggle for social equality, for doing away with discriminations, whether they're based on discrimination against sexual minorities or religious minorities, or in India, the so-called lower castes, or on the basis of race and so on. The fourth and equally important one is the sustenance of cultural and knowledge diversity. With the colonial period, one of the things that has happened is that we tend to think of knowledge as being only modern science and technology, whereas in fact there are many different forms of knowledges and technologies, many different forms of sciences, and of course the cultures that underlie it, whether it's linguistic diversity or food diversity or arts and crafts and so on. And much of that has got eroded or wiped out because of colonization, but the movements now are trying to revive or sustain what still exists and to bring it back into the commons. And finally, my personal favorite, the fifth sphere, is that of radical ecology, of trying to reintegrate ourselves within nature, not separate from nature, as unfortunately modern Western some forms of industrial modernization have taught us. And then also bringing back the notion that we are not a pyramid of life with a man on top, but a circle of life where all species are considered to be equally worthy of respect and have rights. At the core of this, at the actual center of this flower of transformation is a set of values and principles. And this is really important because what we cannot do is to say that, okay, let's copy the Kurdish movement, or let's copy the Zapatista, or let's copy the Quechua indigenous people in Peru and replicate it in our place, or that any of these initiatives should become bigger and bigger and bigger. It's called upscaling. But what's important is learn the principles that were used, the values, the ethics that actually emerge from or were the foundations of these transformations. And I'm going to put them up here. Perhaps I can come back to this in the discussion if somebody's interested. But I'll just mention one or two briefly. So clearly the principle of self-governance, of autonomy, which makes democracy much more radical and direct. Or the principle of cooperation in the commons. I recall during the 2 or 3 year crazy period of the COVID pandemic, when not just with health, but also economies collapsed in many parts of the world. Those communities who did well were the ones who still had their commons intact and had solidarity intact, or were able to quickly build that in so that people are not left to their individual ways of trying to deal with health and economic crises. These are values which say that why should intellectual work be paid more than physical labor? Why should the farmer actually get such a low wage, whereas those who write about farmers actually get paid more? These are values which talk about a notion of enoughness. And this is possibly something that the degrowth movement is also building in, or should be building in, is how much is enough? Are we going to be forever running after more and more and more material goods and consumption? Or are we at some point saying, no, it's enough for us to have this amount and not more? So, as I said, I'm not going to go into these in any detail, but if you look at all of these together, put them together, you actually end up with what could be thought of as worldviews that celebrate life. And in that sense, then celebrities are not those who become overnight famous or rich or powerful, but who actually are sustaining life, such as all the movements that I just mentioned, so-called ordinary people who are sustaining agricultural biodiversity, wildlife, ecosystems, their cultures, their languages, and so much more. So one such worldview, which comes from ancient Indian movements, is the old Indian word was Swaraj, which means self-rule, but we've extended that to include eco, as in self-rule, but also bringing in the rest of nature. It's a very simple idea that wherever we are decision makers, not leaving it to politicians and bureaucrats and so on. But in the decision-making process, we are mindful of what our actions might do to other people and to the rest of nature. So in that sense, it's a radical democracy. We are decision makers, but it's also building in ecological and social responsibility and equality as crucial values. Now, this eco-Swaraj, and again, we can discuss this more, is fairly different from degrowth in many ways, but there are also commonalities, and I'll get to that in a minute. There are lots of similar related, but also different worldviews, concept, cosmovisions from different parts of the world. Some are being revived as part of movements today from ancient indigenous peoples' cosmovisions, such as the ones you can see listed here. Some are radical interpretations of the major religions, for instance, socially engaged Buddhism, or movements within Christianity and Jainism and Hinduism and so on, which are trying to bring back a fundamental notion of spiritual solidarity and well-being, rather than the kind of dogmatic domination that unfortunately religions have been subjected to. And then, of course, notions emerging from within the capitalist industrialized West, such as degrowth, ecofeminism, and others. Now, what I think is very important is, and this is why we've used the word pluriverse and not universe, it is plural, it is multiple, all of these are unique in themselves. None is an umbrella for the other. And this is something we've had to assert over the last few years, because even the series, it's interesting because until recently we were saying, okay, how do we go beyond development and beyond growth? Now it seems we have to go beyond degrowth also, because inadvertently, not deliberately, but inadvertently, degrowth seems to be also taking over alternatives across the world. And so we have to push back a little bit. And it's good that you guys are organizing this kind of series. Okay, let me finish in the next couple of minutes. So what are the commonalities between, let's say, degrowth and some of these global South approaches? I think more and more, each of us or each of these approaches are challenging dominant structures, like the ones I put up earlier. Many of the values and principles that I listed are also in common, like solidarity, for instance. All of them, to my mind, challenge economic growth as the fulcrum of well-being and of development. And I think more and more also, both in the global North and the global South, we're beginning to talk about decolonization of mindsets and cultures and governance. But I think there's also differences, and I think these need to be respected. If you look at starting points, for instance, in the global North, the starting point is how does one move out of the ills of affluence and overproduction, overconsumption, whereas in the global South, it's about how do we move out of real poverty and deprivation. So, which doesn't mean that we need economic growth necessarily, but we need ways by which to expand the benefits to people who are currently not having enough, while perhaps reducing those of others. The other difference could be that whereas for a lot of the global South movements, especially in the indigenous peoples, the integration of material, spiritual, cultural, or rational and non-rational approaches is intuitive. It's seamless. It's not something that is separated and has to be brought back together, which is how it probably is in the global North. What do we do in order to be able to bring together, understand both the commonalities and the differences, and forge alliances across the world, is to be able to understand each other, respect each other, think of each other as being unique and equal, and of course, overcome the unintended domination that I just mentioned earlier. So one of the attempts to try and do that is something we started in 2019, building on the Indian confluence attempt, trying to connect with similar confluences in Colombia, Mexico, Southeast Asia, Germany, various places, is the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. The reason it's called a tapestry is it's not one overarching organization. It's a horizontal bringing together of, as I said, a pluriverse of movements and approaches and ideas on an equal plane. To learn from each other, do more collective actions, do more collective visioning of from local to global, and then, of course, the advocacy that is needed to change the macro picture. All right, so two books that I'd mentioned at the end. One has already been mentioned. This is now, Pluriverse is available now in 6 or 7 languages. It's got 100 essays of radical transformation in different parts of the world. And the reason we did this was to be able to help people move out of an atmosphere of doom and gloom and understand that there are alternatives already out there and many more that can be constructed based on those. The book on the left is a challenge we gave to 40 people in India, saying, how do we move out of the current crisis towards a ideal India of 2100? So think about it from a gender perspective, a sexuality perspective, a conservation perspective, a health perspective, an education perspective, etc. And think a utopian vision. Then come back to now and say, how do we get there? What are the pathways, opportunities, and hurdles to getting there? Both these books are available for free PDF download. I'll put the links in the chat to these and other documents that you can all access. Thanks a lot. Thank you for this opportunity again, and I would love to get into conversation now, but also later if anybody would like to correspond with me. That's my email ID at the bottom.
Wow, absolutely incredible, Ashish. I hope you can see all the emojis that people are sending your way. That's a neat thing about Google Meets. I'm still processing, Ashish, and I've had a very similar presentation from you before last year. But again, thank you so much.
Sorry about that.
Sorry?
I said sorry about that.
No. It's I've still learned so much. Even so, no, I meant that as a good thing, and particularly the fact that you took the time to even add slides specifically for this discussion. That was really cool of you to do so. We can now move on to a more informal discussion. Aya and I have a couple of questions planned, and then we'll open up the floor for anybody to ask their questions. As I mentioned earlier, this is a discussion. It's really neat to see your faces when we're talking to each other. So if you are comfortable with it, we do encourage folks to turn on their camera. I'm happy to go with the first one, and then you take the next one, Aya. Great. Ashish, this is more of a curiosity, and because it was brought up a couple of times, I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about your experience writing the Pluriverse, a post-development dictionary, particularly since you had some of your co-authors and the co-editors and some of the info came from Degrowthers. If you could tell us a little bit about your experience about it and what it has achieved and how you think that it has influenced the degrowth movement overall.
Yeah, thanks, JP. So, well, the story began, I think, in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, interestingly, at a international degrowth conference in, I think, Budapest. What was the one before that? I'm forgetting now. So, anyway, so what happened there was that there was a panel discussion in which there was Alberto Acosta from Ecuador, Federico De Maria, the degrowth movement, you know well, and myself, and we were talking with our own perspectives on our the visions coming out of our respective work. And that sort of, after that session, Alberto and I got to talking, which was interesting because he knew very little English and I knew almost no Spanish. But we still managed a 1-hour conversation in which we kind of came to the understanding that we need to put these concepts together into some sort of a book, right? So the 3 that we had spoken about in the panel, but also more that he knew of or I knew of. And then we got Federico in because he knew both English and Spanish. So he was able to translate better. And we listed out, at that conference actually, we listed out about, I think, 15 or 20 concepts that we'd like to ask other people to write about and put this together. Then we got Arturo Escobar in because Alberto and I both felt that he was a fantastic voice to bring in, had already started writing about pluriverse. And then we said, oh gosh, 4 men, that's really bad. So we needed to find at least a couple of other women. So then we asked Ariel and we asked 1 or 2 others who could not join, but Ariel Saleh from Australia, eco-feminist, well-known author, was happy to join. So that's how the editorial team got put together. And then from the original 15 to 20, we kept adding more and more and more, and eventually came to 90 worldviews and practices. And then we said, enough, we can't go on because it will become a lifetimes project or a multi-generational project. So we stopped at 90. But then we started actually thinking about, okay, we're focusing on alternatives, but we do need some sort of introductory portions on a critique of development. So 1 from each continent. And then also, like the slide that I showed on electric vehicles, we needed to bring in some essays on what we thought were false alternatives. So that's what's really, people are, the system is trying to brainwash all of us into saying that carbon trading and zero carbon and all that kind of stuff is really the solutions, right? So then we came up, I think, about 14 or 15 essays on solutions that don't really challenge the system. Anyway, so that's how it happened. For us, the other big question was language, because of course we were a mix of English and Spanish, but we also wanted to encourage other languages, but that got logistically very difficult to do. There were 1 or 2 in Arabic and French, which were translated, but mostly it was English and Spanish. The challenge, I think one of the biggest challenge also was to get authors to write in brief. People, especially the academics amongst the authors, and there are a few, don't want to write only 1,000 words. So we had said no, strict limit of 1,000 words, less if possible, because this is oriented to people, and write in simple language. Please don't use jargon, because this is oriented at people who may know nothing about subjects you're writing on. We want to get to people who are not already converted and already part of the movement, right? So especially young people in universities or elsewhere around the world. So that was a bit of a challenge, and then you can understand trying to get 130 authors to write within a certain span of time, doing the editing back and forth. Anyway, that's all part of the logistics. But the other interesting part was this question that I raised. If there's a pluriverse, is there something in common? What binds the book together? So that was a very interesting discussion amongst us editors and some of the authors. And that's where we sort of came upon this thing that while each is unique, there are certain values and principles that are common. Like I said, the commons, the solidarity, diversity, etc. And that is, in some senses, I wouldn't say universal, but common to this pluriverse of things. So that was a discussion we had. The 5 editors met only once in that 4-year period. It's obviously, from all over the world, it's not easy to meet. But we did meet once in Barcelona, and that's when we kind of conceived of an introductory piece which had this thing of differences but also commonalities. How has it influenced the degrowth movement? I don't know. You people need to tell me more. Maybe I should ask Federico. But I think that the fact that more and more of the degrowth movement is also recognizing that there are global south approaches, that everything is not degrowth. Possibly Pluriverse, the book, has contributed to that. I don't know. Just guessing that it may have contributed to that, especially now because it's available in 6 or 7 languages: French, German, Italian, Spanish, etc. So, but it has certainly been used a lot in universities. Almost everywhere that I go or I speak to a university online, they say, yeah, we're already using Pluriverse, the book. That makes me happy. Beyond that, I don't know if it's having any effect. Maybe some of you can tell me. Thanks.
Thank you.
And incidentally, sorry, just to add quickly, through the global tapestry of alternatives now, there is a second phase that has just begun. So another 50 or 100 terms are going to be added, not in the same form as the Pluriverse book, but in some form or the other, with many more languages coming in. So people from different cultures can actually write about or express in some way their concepts and notions of well-being or alternatives. And we're going to put that together over the next couple of years.
Oh, that's incredible. I cannot wait for that. Particularly making it more accessible. I think it's so crucial and something the degrowth movement struggles a lot with. It's so abstract and jargony. A lot of the time it's not relatable, and predominantly in English form. So I'm super excited to hear that. Super quick, I think your book has had a very positive influence on the degrowth movement, at least in helping folks see that there are different alternatives. However, I think an unintended consequence, and this is something I really try to push back very strongly to, and I know you do too, Ashish, is what, and you were referring to this in the conversation. I really struggle when people call degrowth an umbrella term, right? And I think it can be very, I mean, it's very innocent, right? And I know people don't mean wrong when they say so, but like you said, it perpetuates these systems of hegemony, right? Of degrowth overtaking ideas that have existed for well before degrowth was even coined as a term. So if anyone here wants to leave with something, please don't call degrowth an umbrella term, and please recognize that it is influenced by many other movements and thoughts and philosophies from around the world. Yeah, but I'll let Aya ask the next question.
Yeah. So we've been thinking in the Global South working group, like how can the degrowth movement really become a true ally to the Global South? So what do you think, in your opinion, is missing from this movement? And here, as we're forming the IDN, what can we do to become true allies?
Well, thanks. I actually last year did a piece for GIZ, the main aid agency, the German government's aid agency. They asked me to do a piece on what would Beyond Growth approaches to international solidarity or international aid look like. And there were a number of things I put there. But one of the things I said was that, and I quoted, I think, Ivan Illich, because Ivan Illich was once asked, you all know Ivan Illich, the decolonial, I don't know, anti-development or post-development thinker from Austria who spent most of his life in Mexico. So Ivan Illich was asked by an American university to come and give a lecture because the university students were going to go to South America to help people there to develop and overcome their problems. So Ivan Illich was very rude. As brilliant as he was also very rude. So he went and said that, look, if you guys are going to help, don't go, just stay here. I'm sorry you invited me, so I'm going to be very frank about this. And so don't go. If you're going to learn and to also talk about what you have learned or what you know of in a spirit of equality and mutual respect, then by all means go. And then it was a very long lecture, basically expanding on this. So essentially, one of the things we've been saying is that people from the global north, including degrowth movement, should shed, if they have any. Many of my friends in degrowth movement don't have it, but many others do. If they have any notions that, okay, we're already well off and we can help the global south to overcome its problems. I think that's one of the things to get rid of. The second thing is how do you decolonize yourselves? You as in, let's say, the global north, right? Because as much as the global north has colonized the global south, it has actually self-colonized also. In terms of its own mindset and notions of what is development, what is it to be human, what is knowledge, what is science, what is technology, there's a lot of implicit and over generations, of course, kind of stuffed into us notions that we need to unlearn. And one great way of unlearning that would be to actually establish mutually respectful relationships with people from the global south who will question that. So, why is it that there's so much scholarship from the global north of the global south? Latin American studies, African studies, Asian studies. There are universities all across Europe who are doing this. But universities in India, for instance, do they do European studies? Are they even allowed or enabled to do European studies? Are we enabled to actually come there and question your lifestyles? I think we need to build those sorts of relationships. And some degrowthers are, in fact, trying to do that. So that's great. And the third crucial thing, which I think degrowth movement is already doing to some extent, is to look at the footprint of the global north. And that, of course, is something the degrowth movement is saying we need to scale down, because not just we are destroying ourselves, but also we're destroying the rest of the earth, and we're eating up climate space, etc. So that's already happening, but much more of this needs to happen. So yeah, these 2-3 thoughts that I have.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting, especially this savior complex that takes place. I think I kind of have a follow-up question. When you say like that societies need to unlearn, you touched upon this radical ecology in your presentation. In your opinion, what is a process that a society can collectively kind of go through of unlearning? Because typically it like happens on an individual basis. So how can we actually catalyze this for a whole society, if you have seen examples of this?
Well, I think obviously one of the most important things to do is to transform the education system, because we all learn what it is to be a life form or a human being or a man or a woman or whatever we're, the identities that we give to ourselves or society gives to us. We learn that while we are in school and growing up in our families. So to me, these two spheres of influence, the educational institution and the family life itself or the community life, are crucial spaces in which to rebuild our understanding, respect for, love for, and relationship within nature. That doesn't mean we have to be living in a forest to do that. It could be a city. I mean, even our cities are full of so much, of the rest of nature, right? If we care to look. So it's about being sensitive to. I remember during the COVID pandemic, I actually built up an even closer relationship than I had with the tree outside my window. I was stuck in my house for a long periods of time. This tree was blooming, yellow flowers. Flowers were flying into my window, and I knew it. I respected it. I loved the tree in terms of its aesthetics, but actually building a bond, that's when it happened, because possibly I'd never given myself the time and space and mental and emotional space to actually make that linkage. As a child, it's so much easier to make those linkages if those opportunities exist. And I know even in Europe, for instance, when I was in Czech Republic a few years back, they told me about these forest schools. I think they're there in Germany also, maybe elsewhere, where classes of kids are actually, teaching or learning happens inside a forest, living there and things like that on occasion. So that's the kind of maybe collective things that could be happening in educational institutions and of course through families. That's for kids, but for adults also it becomes really, really important to provide such opportunities. Instead of just watching nature on National Geographic or whatever television is giving us, which is great, of course. How does one create the opportunity for people to understand that just the neighboring park, the park in my neighborhood, actually has probably 50 species that I can understand and relate to and watch over seasons, right? So I think we just have to be able to create more and more such opportunities, and build into those ethics, the ethics of love, of generosity, of respect, of rights, so it's not just about saying, oh, this is Bohemia Vahalai, okay, that's a scientific name, and then you say, okay, good, I've listed it on my thing and I've ticked it off. But to actually say, what is our relationship with that tree or that bird or that insect? So we just have to do much more of that.
Thank you for that, JP. Feel free to ask the next question.
Thanks, Ashish and Aya. And I think we might maybe leave this as the last one so that we can give enough space for everyone else to also ask questions. Oh, but we had such a good list of questions that it's hard to choose from. I wanted to continue on this about narratives, but I think I'm going to move to, I think, something that I think a lot of us could relate to and hear from you about. Ashish, we know that you've been at this since high school, right? Pushing for social justice, environmental justice, and you've worked with hundreds of people and organizations. Yet the powers that be still continue to push back. after having been doing this for so long and still doing it, showing up today, and with everything else you have going on, how do you keep going? And do you have any advice for folks who might be falling into despair or losing some hope to continue the fight?
Yeah, JP. So I think one of the reasons why I moved over about 15 years, so 12, 15 years back into a much more intense search for alternatives was exactly this. Because for the first about 25, 30 years of my work on environmental issues, environment development issues, livelihoods, rights, etc., a lot of it was about protest and critique and saying no. And of course, that is still important because we have to, like I said, or resistance itself is also an alternative. But I was getting more and more the feeling, and people were also asking us, including those from the public, saying, you guys are always saying no. What are you saying yes to? And so actually getting into this, and even as we were doing that, we knew that on the ground, even those communities who were facing displacement and dispossession and deprivation were actually searching for their own answers and were coming up with some very creative things. And even in the midst of despair, they were actually still joking. They were hosting us. They were being generous. They were laughing in the midst of enormous sorrows and people being killed and jailed and all of that. Right? So when we were seeing this, we said, okay, we need to do this much more intensively, much more with a greater focus, both to understand those radical alternatives, but also to try and bring them together. Because the worst thing that can happen is the feeling of loneliness, that I'm the only one, or our community is the only one that is actually resisting, or the only one who's trying to find a solution. The more we're able to connect with each other, the more there is hope and inspiration to be able to counter the gloom and doom and government attacks or corporate attacks or whatever. So that's one important thing, and for me, that's been a great source of inspiration and hope, and why I managed to keep going. The second one is the rest of nature itself. I recently had the most amazing experience. I spoke earlier about my experience with the flowering tree outside my window during COVID pandemic, but just a few months back, I was down in South India at a wonderful waterfall. And while coming back from the waterfall, I was watching some monkeys, monkey babies playing with each other. And you can watch monkey babies playing with each other for hours. It's just absolute delight. So then this one baby actually stopped, went and sat on a fence. I was looking at it, trying to take a photograph. It was looking at me. I realized that it was actually looking at me with not hostility, which often happens because actually staring at a monkey is a sign of hostility. I put my camera down and I just extended my hand like this. It bent down and smelt my finger and then reached across with its fingers and touched me, like for a second, right? Very, very brief touch. And in that moment, that split second moment, I felt what I've written about then called eternity in a second. It was like all of evolution and beyond evolution, all that the kinship of life to me came alive in that 1 second. And I've had a few such experiences also in the past. And I think therefore the inspiration, the beauty, the aesthetics, the generosity of nature, which I keep experiencing, is also what keeps me going. So it's really these two things, JP.
I don't even know what to say. Thank you, Ashish. I think everyone in this call could have used that, and will benefit from that. Really, thank you. Whew. Oh my God, I'm tearing up. Maybe we can open the floor. It looks like 4 folks have their hands up. I'm looking at the queue, and Elena, it seems that you are first.
Hello. First of all, thank you for that beautiful story. Like, it was really inspiring. And also thank you for this talk. I've been reading quite a few of your texts, so what a great opportunity to hear you speak live. My question is could you tell us a little about maybe some projects where frameworks have been implemented?
The what? Sorry, can you repeat that?
Some projects or some cases where these frameworks of, say, ecological Swaraj, for instance, have been implemented.
Uh-huh. Yeah, sure, Elena. So actually, some of the examples that I gave are places where this is being implemented. There's one example I didn't give, but I can give it now, is of 5,000 women farmers in South India who belong to the so-called Dalit caste, or the so-called untouchables, the most oppressed, marginalized section of Indian Hindu society. These women were facing extreme deprivation, in terms of hunger, malnutrition, no access to education, health facilities, etc., till they gathered themselves together as women's committees in many villages, about 70 villages, and a federation of these. And they said that the first thing we need to do is make sure we have enough food in the house for our kids and our family. And so they brought back their traditional varieties of seeds. They completely got rid of chemicals, hybrid seeds, everything the government was giving them, and said, we want to bring back our traditional seeds. We want to grow with no chemicals. We want to grow with whatever rainfall we have. And it's one of India's driest areas. And to show that we can actually produce enough food with whatever little land we have, with our knowledge, our seeds, and sharing all of that as part of the commons. It's a long story, but I'm cutting it short. So in over about 10, 15 years, they were able to achieve that for 5,000 families. But then they went beyond that and said, why should be only food security? It should be food sovereignty. What I also told you about with the Quechua indigenous people in the Andes in Peru. That is our full control over everything to do with food, seeds, knowledge, land, water, etc. They also fought for rights for women over land, which in India is very rare. Then they went beyond that and said, why is it that our stories are not being carried by the mainstream media? So let's create our own radio station. Let's create our own filmmaking unit. So they actually have a community media unit, which has already made more than 100 films, all made by these women. Why not, our stuff is not taught in the government schools or the private schools. Why don't we start our own school? So they started their own school, and so on. So basically what was happening was that you see that starting with food, which is one sphere, let's say, of life, moving into, and of course, livelihoods connected to that, moving into the social transformations needed as Dalits and as women against patriarchy and against casteism, moving into the sphere of alternative education, moving to the sphere of alternative media, and a lot more. Festivals, culture, bringing back a lot of the old songs, celebrating the festival of every religion, because they said, why we are Hindus, but why should we celebrate only Hindu festivals? Why not Muslim? Why not Christian? Why not Jain? So celebrating all of that and bringing back the spiritual connection with the earth and with seeds, so that they are not looked at only as economic commodities. So you see, therefore, a Swaraj, an eco-Swaraj kind of a picture emerging from this movement. Of course, there's still much more to be done, but you begin to see that, different spheres and the intersections amongst them are being worked out in this. But it's a long process. This is 30 years, 35 years of process. It's not a 3-year project, which is also what I told GIZ in my paper. I said, you give 5 years of funds or 3 years of funds and you expect transformations to take place. It doesn't work like that, especially for the most marginalized sections of people and for wildlife. So that's one example, Elena, but I'd be happy to give you many, many more. We're now actually using the flower of transformation to also help people understand what kinds of changes are taking place, what is the impact of, let's say, economic transformations on the environment, on gender, on culture, and are there contradictions that are taking place inadvertently? Can they make things more holistic by understanding those contradictions, and so on? So there is a tool that people use called the alternatives transformation format, which is based on the flower of transformation. I'd be happy to send it to any of you who wants to see it and use it.
Thank Thank you, Ashish. And I forgot to mention this earlier. It's a shame that I've just moved because right in my old apartment, right on my desk behind where I would work, I had a diagram of your flower of transformations. So I would always remember and keep that in mind. Next in line in the questions list is Christian.
Well, first of all, thanks also from me, Ashish, for the inspiring and encouraging ideas and your work. And my question is that I come from Germany, and we have a sociologist here who's called Rosa, and he talks about an idea of us being in relationship and connection to specific to other people, to the world, to animals, and these also can be stuck or can be unseen. And when you talk about radical ecology, for me, this is something like a root cause for not being in connection and therefore not caring about Earth or the shared life. And do you have ideas like books or other ideas how to teach ourselves and also others then to get into a relationship with a living world on like a subject relation, not as in an objective world?
There's actually a lot of material out there now, Christian, on this, including in the global north. Because people are feeling spiritually deprived or in some way or the other, sort of the alienation from the rest of nature is really badly affecting all of us, of course. So there is a lot of material out there in terms of, for instance, our sort of kinship with all of life. So if you look up kinship with life or kinship with all of life or animal kinship, etc., you'll find some material. There's a lot of very interesting material on new understandings of the fact that we are not separate from other species. If you begin to understand whales and dolphins and octopus and even crows and so on, there's some very, very interesting new material on how a diversity of bird song, if one is growing up or living in an environment with a diversity of bird song, it makes one happier than if there's there's only one bird, one species outside or none at all. So there's a whole explosion of literature, and I'd be happy to send you some if you send me an email. Yeah, if you look at even fiction, no, there's a lot of fiction out there which is actually now trying to build this in. If you look at, for instance, from the Western world, people like Barbara Kingsolver and her novels, where she talked about, she just builds in fantastic stories around relationships with nature, but they're also real life. I mean, they're also very compelling stories as novels, as fiction. And there's a lot more. There's actually a lot of fiction also on climate fiction, which is trying to build this in. We have actually a series going on right now, a webinar series on climate fiction. We've done 2 episodes. There's a third one coming up on oceans and climate fiction in, I think, early April. And if you're interested, please email me. We'll put you on the list for that webinar series. So yeah, I mean, I don't know where to stop, Christian. I mean, there is actually a lot out there. There's also a lot of material on how does one create fun opportunities for young people to relate to nature in whatever context we're in. It could be in the middle of a city, it could be in a village, it could be global south, it could be global north. So that's quite a lot, which I remember, in fact, when I was young, even at that time, there was a book from an American who had an adopted Indian name, something Bharat Joseph Cornell or something like that, on learning nature with kids. With a lot of activities on what could happen in a US kind of context. So yeah, I'm going to stop there. But Christian, if you email me, I can certainly send you some literature and contacts with others who are much better at this than I am.
Thanks a lot, Ashish. I think we have Mavra next.
Hi. Hi, Ashish. I'm your neighbor from Pakistan. Nice to meet you and nice to meet everyone. But seriously, what a wonderful time it's been listening to you. I've learned so much that I wish I had a notepad with me, but I don't. I wanted to note down all the great things you were saying and all the great resources you were talking about, especially what, right, you just spoke about how to connect with children and how to, kind of build our relationships with nature. So if you're sending them to anyone else, share my email address. Please share them with me as well. So Ashish, it's one of the reasons why it's been so great to listen to you is that I'm feeling very disconnected as someone who I think maybe it's been a year and a half or maybe 2 years when I kind of found out about the degrowth movement and like, and it really resounded with me as an alternative to capitalism, of course. And honestly, like one of the last solutions that I think can actually work if humanity and all living creatures are to have any fighting chance on this planet. So but I was kind of trying to figure out, because degrowth really does talk more about the developed world and their them changing. So I never really understood, like, okay, how can like countries like Pakistan, India, like especially like post-colonial countries and emerging economies, how can we be part of this conversation? Because I think I've worked in the development sector for quite some time, and of course we are actually, because of GDP and the development aid sector, we are being kind of like positioned to kind of achieve the developed world, like like GDP and being more affluent in very material ways, right? So listening to you has been really interesting in that way. But I'd like to ask you, what kind of advice would you have for someone like me in Pakistan, where I feel like degrowth is hardly even acknowledged, talked about, people don't really know, but then other than degrowth, like all of these indigenous kind of ways of being and community living, all of those things, like I don't really understand how I can help kind of like bring this campaigning around so it's very compelling to people to actually be part of this conversation. So any advice you'd have on that would be really, really helpful.
Thanks, Maura, and very happy to be in touch with anybody from Pakistan because it's so difficult to do that for both of us.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think we used to work with some Pakistani groups on community-based conservation, because that was some of the earlier work we did, challenging Western notions of protected areas and wildlife conservation, and saying in our contexts they should be centered around communities and our own knowledge systems and our institutions and so on. And there were some very good Pakistani colleagues who were collaborating with us. It was a South Asia level process that we had begun. This is 2 decades back. And now, in the recent past, we have been trying to connect with groups, including in Pakistan, but with great difficulty, on the whole alternatives confluence bit. So recently at the World Social Forum in Nepal, for instance, we had a session where people from different parts of South Asia, unfortunately none of the Pakistanis were there, but other countries, to come together and say, can we expand what we're doing in India to a South Asian level? Trying to bring together people who are working on alternatives or wanting to work on alternatives from any perspective, on the ground practice, academic research, activism, whatever. And I'm reasonably sure that there will be many groups in Pakistan who are also already doing this, right? Trying to practice alternatives in some form or the other, though in a very difficult context. And I'd be happy to connect with you and also start exploring and exchanging some names, both in Pakistan and in India and other parts of South Asia, so that we can keep building a constituency of people and organizations who can at least correspond with each other, if not meet each other once in a while, to be able to push this whole alternatives narrative much more. Both in terms of resistance, but especially, I think, trying to convince our policymakers and so on that these are solutions that are grounded, that are already available. Why are you looking for things coming from America and Europe and so on? We already have them. And if anything, let's exchange amongst each other. That's one thing. The second thing, quickly, if I should mention, is that there's something called the South Asia Bioregionalism Working Group, where, if you remember what I mentioned about nation-state boundaries in South Asia, one of the things we're trying to do is to connect across South Asia to see how do we begin to reimagine South Asia from a biocultural perspective. Reconnect, for instance, across Siachen, reconnect the communities in India and Pakistan, or Ladakh and what was called Baltistan earlier, or Ladakh and Tibet, or the Sundarbans in India and Bangladesh. How do we at least begin to think about it and connect and start discussing the possibilities of these kinds of exchanges, which could also eventually lead to movements for peace zones. Instead of war zones in these boundary areas, we can actually start trying to create peace zones, which are ecologically and socially grounded. So anyway, these are some of the ideas, and I'd be happy to be in touch with you.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you so much for that. That's already very helpful, and I look forward to connecting with you bilaterally. I did have a question about that from the organizers as well. Like, will you be sending us like the presentations and the links, or how will this work? Like, how do we get in touch with each other if we want to like take the conversations forward?
Yeah, we'll be sharing after this an email with the recording, all the documents and the links that Ashish mentioned, and also his presentation. So keep an eye for that.
Sure, I will. Thank you to the organizers, and thank you so much, Ashish. I look forward to speaking with you soon.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Mavra. Ashish, I suppose we didn't ask you. Can we share your presentation?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I should have mentioned it. I usually do that. There's no copyright on it, so please do share it, and anybody is free to use it in whatever way they want. This is in recognition of the fact that these are not necessarily my ideas. They have been, like, I mean, yeah, it's thousands of years of people's work. So I'm just kind of building on. So I have no right to claim any copyright on it.
Thank you, Ashish. Yeah, so everybody watch out for that email, which we'll send either later today, most likely tomorrow, with more information and more information about our next talk as well. Next on the list, I see Svenja. I hope I said your name right. Oh, can folks hear them?
No.
No, we still can't hear you, unfortunately. In the meantime, maybe Felix would like to ask their question, and then we'll come back to you, Svenja.
Sure. Thank you very much for your presentation, your insights, and your answers so far, Ashish. My question is more, I guess, strategy-based. A few years ago, many progressive organizations throughout the world, especially in South America and Africa and Southeast Asia, created the Progressive International. I think it was under the leadership of the Ecuadorian president. But I don't think either the Global Tapestry of Alternatives or Vikat Sangam or any actually degrowth-based or post-development-based organizations joined the Progressive International. So is there any reason why, in terms either of the strategy they chose to follow or on core post-development, post-growth, radical ecology grounds that there was no agreements on? Or is there a ground for a potential future work together and alliance together with this organization? What do you think about this?
Thanks, Felix. Good question. So, yes, I think when it started, many of us were quite excited because it seemed like a platform that was bringing together a lot of very interesting, grounded, but also very high-profile people, and something like that could be necessary. Yes and no. We have actually, the GTA started 2 years or 3 years back, a international platform, which was eventually called Adelante, in which there are 8 global processes, in which Progressive International is one of them. The idea was that Progressive International, grassroots to global, the Global Green New Deal, etc. There were many such global processes to come, and the World Social Forum also, to come together and synergize, not at least duplicate each other, and also respect each other's differences, but also work together on whatever we can work together. Right? So that began, and it went well for some time, but then since it was completely voluntary, I think people lost steam, and we're now trying to revive it. But so in that sense, there is a very clear attempt to try and reach across to Progressive International and have some alliances there. But no, as in, for us, especially in the global tapestry of alternatives, the notions of democracy, we may have some differences of opinion on what the notion of democracy is. Now, Progressive International is very heavily invested in making sure that there are fair elections, that revolutionary parties get into power in different countries, etc. That's okay. I have no problems with that. For us, the greater focus might be how do people claim power on the ground, rather than parties claiming power in nation-state centers. Maybe both need to go together, but there is some tension there. It's not all complementary. There is some amount of tension. And this is an area of discussion that we actually have to have much more. This is also an area of discussion within the World Social Forum, and one of the sources of both tension and complementarity. So we just have to have more of that with the Progressive International. Not very easy getting hold of them. They're so busy having their independent monitoring in different parts of the world that very hard to get hold of them. But we're trying to see that at least we work together on what's common, even as we respect each other's differences. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was it for me.
Thank you, Ashish. I think we have time for one last question. Svenja, do you want to try again?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. Sorry, I had to get my headphones. Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I was wondering, because of course within degrowth and alternatives to growth, alternatives to development, all those kinds of spaces, there's a lot of activity from different social movements, non-governmental organizations, those kind of actors, also academics. But I'm wondering how you see this also translating maybe into more formal systems or formal legal systems. One thing I'm thinking about here as an example is the UN declarations on the rights of peasants, that is enshrining certain rights, like the right to seeds, which I think, like you also talked about seeds before. But yeah, I was wondering if you can say maybe something about this, if you see alternatives mostly remaining within this local grassroots kind of organizational space, or also having to at some point maybe move into more, yeah, formal legal spaces. Thanks.
Thanks, Svenja. That's a really good question, important one, and my answer is going to be a bit simplistic because of lack of time, but happy to correspond subsequently on this. So let's look at it like this. I think for a lot of us, the long-term movement is towards complete systems shift, right? Very fundamental paradigm shifts in economy, politics, etc. All those 5 spheres that I spoke about. However, we know that's not going to happen overnight. It is a long-term struggle. So meanwhile, we also fight for spaces within the system. And that addresses your issue. So for instance, insofar as we can get, let's say, a United Nations declaration on rights of nature, or the one you mentioned, or the UN declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples, human rights long back, etc. Those are things one should certainly fight for, but not just at UN, but also at national level. For instance, constitutions, like the movement happening right now in Chile, or in other places of the world where people are trying to bring in many of these notions into their constitutions or into law, including rights of nature or labor rights or human rights or whatever, are also important spaces. In India, for instance, one of the most important struggles has been getting the right to information or the right to employment. or the right to commons, right? And these have all become enshrined in some law or the other because of people's movements and some element of, a few progressive people within the government also. So yeah, I think we have to do both, but I think we need to be clear that even as we fight for those spaces in national and international circles, we can't stop there, because there is a tendency for nation states and even the UN to eventually co-opt a lot of these things into ways by which their own power base and their own profit making, or the profit making of corporations that they're hand in glove with, is taken further. You take the UN compact, for instance, with corporations across the world. It's one of the most problematic things that we've seen. You take in India right now the crony capitalism that's taking place, where in the name of environment, actually a whole lot of really disastrous stuff is happening, like mega solar projects in the name of climate. You begin to see that actually, or for instance, you take Bolivia and Ecuador, where Buen Vivir or Sumak Kause, or the rights of Mother Earth, have actually been enshrined in law or in constitution, but have then been co-opted by government saying, no, mining is okay in that area. It's within the parameters of the rights of Mother Earth and rights of nature. So one has to be very careful also about when you formalize and legalize any of these alternative notions, are they actually taking us further, or might they also be regressive in the sense of being co-opted? And sorry, just one last word on this. So I was told recently from Latin America also that a lot of social movements are very upset with the fact that so-called revolutionary governments co-opt a lot of the social movements, the NGOs, the local movements, etc. And then when it comes time to actually still have an independent voice, because those parties, when they take over power, don't necessarily do all the transformations needed, then people are no longer available because they've become a minister somewhere or a bureaucrat somewhere else, or have got funded from this revolutionary party. So I think there are pluses and minuses to all this. One has to just be very careful about how do you balance between the truly revolutionary system shifts that we need and the reforms that we can keep fighting on.
Thank you so much, Ashish. I think that's a perfect place to end the call. And with that, we are done for today. Ashish, thank you a million times so much for giving us some of your time and your wisdom and knowledge. And folks, Ashish shared their email on the chat, so do reach out and do join the IDN if that's of interest to you folks. Thank you everybody for attending and for your wonderful, wonderful and engaging questions. See you folks in the next meeting next week.
Thank you so much. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Great. I gotta run.
All right.
This was amazing.
It really was.
Amazing. Don't forget to turn off the recording.
Recording? Yes.
Yeah, and then send it over whenever, and we can do the same thing as last time.
Wow.
I am fantastic.
Amazing.